When you have cauldrons of privation and dysfunction in our inner cities, no good middle class jobs, or very few of them, low incomes, poor education, high dropout rates, so you have a lot of teenagers that are not going to school and are out and about during the day. Of course, you're going to have much more crime. You're going to have much more drug abuse, alcohol abuse, domestic violence. That would be true of any people group, but that merely reinforces the stereotype and enables white people to rationalize the negative perceptions they have about African Americans. I mean, that's a terrible, vicious cycle that we have got to get over in our country. And frankly, if this were happening to white people, it would be a national catastrophe. We would not allow it to continue. Those young African American children are going to be growing up with our children and grandchildren. Do we want them working with our children, building a better world, adding wealth to our country, or do we want them to be relegated to the social welfare system and the criminal justice system, or both? Not nearly as many African Americans are doing as well as they could be or should be because of the horrible structural impediments that we've left in place and left largely unaddressed in our country. And I bring this up not just because I love black people, but because I love America. And this racial disparity, the racial divide we have in our country, is corrosive. Our enemies could not deploy a more effective weapon in our country than the racial situation that we have right now. They're laughing at us. We have to have a plan. And the fact that our government has spent trillions of dollars over the past 60 years trying to alleviate poverty and supposedly trying to help African Americans does not mean that nothing can work, just because those programs have not worked nearly as well as they were supposed to. That's kind of like saying I spent a ton of money on a quack doctor and he didn't cure me, so I guess nothing will work. Well, how about going out and getting a doctor who's not a quack? Let me lay out what some of the provisions of that plan might include. The cities, the police departments around the country that do the best job of reducing crime, the best job of diverting young people that get in trouble from the prison track and enable them to turn their life around and avoid prison and get out of the criminal justice system, and the best job of engendering community trust, especially the minority community, and that would be based on surveys conducted by third parties, would get a block criminal justice success grant from the federal government to use to further those programs and to enhance their law enforcement activities. That, to me, is a productive way for the federal government to help make local police departments more effective and more responsive, especially to the African American communities in those cities. Cities would compete for that. That could be marketed. That's a great way to lure business, to even increase tourism. Hey, we're a city that's a recipient of a criminal justice success grant. The education that low-income African Americans are receiving for the most part in this country is inexcusably bad. It's awful. And we have got to turn that around, not just by improving the schools that they go to, but by creating a better environment after school and during the summer, because a huge percentage of low-income African American children in the United States live in single-mother households. They live in poverty. They live in dangerous neighborhoods. That's not a great environment to go home to after school. So I believe every low-income child, certainly the lowest income 10% of kids in our country, disproportionately African American and Latino, should have access to a quality, non-government after-school program and summer program. That would basically mean around 1,000 hours a year less spent in bad neighborhood situations, exposed to bad influences, and in a nurturing environment where they can learn, where they can get homework done, where they can be exposed to adults that are positive role models, good examples, people they can talk to, get counseling from, get guidance from. That's the closest we can come from a government policy point of view to replicating a middle-class lifestyle for these kids that are in these really tough problematic neighborhoods. That will help them make much better life choices later. That will reduce teen pregnancy. That will reduce drug abuse. That will reduce crime among these children and get them on a much better track. Between equalizing funding for charter schools, creating vouchers for private and schools run by religious organizations and giving low-income kids, many more kids, access to that, and creating these crucial after-school and summer programs that will cost across the country, that will cost billions of dollars. Where do we get the money for that? Well, we get it from a wealth tax. Wait a minute, a wealth tax? That's unconstitutional. That's socialism. Hang on a second. We already have a wealth tax. You know what it's called? Local property taxes. That's a wealth tax, right? Most middle-class wealth in this country is in their home ownership. And as homeowners, we pay taxes every year on that wealth, on the value of our home. A lot of people in this country, probably most homeowners, are choking on the increases in property taxes on their homes. So here's my idea. Let's add financial securities like stocks and bonds and mutual funds to the property tax base in all of our states or our local property tax jurisdictions. Right now, there is no property tax on stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, only on homes. Does that make any sense? Wealthy people in this country, most of their wealth is not in land or homes. Most of their wealth is in those financial assets. So what I'm proposing is that every state or every property tax jurisdiction in our country have a $1 million exemption. So in other words, you have to have more than $1 million of stocks, bonds, and or mutual funds to even be hit with the tax. But for those with $1 million or more of financial assets, they would pay, let's say, a 1% property tax every year on those financial holdings. The incremental revenue from that tax on financial assets would be used for two things. One, a big chunk of it would be used to provide property tax relief to middle-class homeowners. The rest of that money, half to two-thirds of it, would be used to pay for after-school and summer programs and to equalize charter school funding, to provide access to private schools and parochial schools for the lowest income children in the community, the lowest income 10 to 15% of the kids in those communities. That's how we can make this work. That's a constitutional and locally administered wealth tax. It's a wealth tax we already have. It's just that right now, those with a lot of stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and millions of dollars worth, the top 5% of our country, they're not paying a property tax on that, but middle income tax people are paying a tax on their home every year. Let's equalize that, and let's do something that will be fairer for property taxpayers in the middle class, but also provide the additional funding to enable low-income kids to have a much better environment after school and a much better quality education at school. Let's have a program in every state where the lowest income 10% of children get free tuition to state schools if they graduate in the top third of their class and if they have no criminal history. That's a great incentive for children. I don't believe in free tuition for everybody to go to college. Let's focus on the kids most in need, and let's make sure that they're in a position to do well in college, which means, of course, that they graduate in the top third of their class. They don't get in any trouble. Those kids should get free tuition. Right now, there's no pipeline from poor neighborhoods to Silicon Valley and to high-tech jobs. No way to get there. That's why African Americans are so underrepresented at the high-tech companies in Silicon Valley. We've got to fix that. There's a lot of talk about the Department of Justice filing antitrust suits against Facebook, against Google. Well, I propose that those companies be given a safe harbor, maybe a 3-year safe harbor, renewable every 3 years, if they take dramatic steps to train young people, to give them access to education, to learning about coding, things that those children would never have access to. If Google and Facebook do that and they can demonstrate actual success, not just put some kind of program in place and give it lip service, but actually demonstrate that they're making a large impact affecting thousands or even millions of low-income kids and enabling them to have the building blocks that they need, the learning that they need to enter the high-tech workforce of our country. Give those companies a safe harbor. Don't pursue antitrust action against those companies. But again, it would be renewable every 3 years. So at the end of 3 years, if they haven't demonstrated success, they'd lose their safe harbor. If they are succeeding, this can continue. Speaking of antitrust, the federal government has given the NFL, the NBA, and in an even broader context, Major League Baseball, antitrust exemptions. All of those leagues can band together. Their owners of the teams can band together to negotiate group-wide television and media contracts. That's exempted from antitrust law. Well, why don't we have the federal government make that conditional on those leagues selling teams to groups controlled by African Americans or Latinos, and also making the capital gains tax on that sale tax exempt? So there'd be a carrot and a stick. The carrot would be that teams that are sold to groups controlled by African Americans or Latinos would be exempt from capital gains, or at least that the capital gains would be deferred if it were reinvested. And secondly, the stick would be that if they don't take action to make that happen, let's say 3 teams over the next 7 years for each of the leagues sold to minority-controlled groups, if they don't make that happen, then they lose their antitrust exemption on their negotiation of TV and media contracts. Corporations. The NFL has what they call the Rooney Rule, which the Rooney family of the owners of the Pittsburgh Steelers came up with many years ago. The Rooney Rule is that any coaching vacancy in the NFL, an African-American candidate must be interviewed. Well, why don't we have the government require that corporations have a Rooney Rule if they are going to maintain their corporation status? That is, at every executive opening, there must be an African American at least interviewed for the position. That's not a quota. That's saying let's open up the hiring process for these high-level jobs outside the circle maybe that we're used to dealing with in these companies. You say, oh my God, that's micromanaging corporations. The government shouldn't do that. Hang on a second. Corporations are not entities devised by God. Corporations are creatures of government policy. They are inventions of the government. They limit liability. Investors can't lose any more money than they put in, and they get lower tax rates than sole proprietors and other business forms do. So corporations get tremendous privileges from the federal government. Corporations, as we know them, didn't even exist when our founders put this country together. In exchange for the substantial government dispensation that corporations receive, yes, they should be required to interview African Americans for every executive position. Not necessarily hire them, but at least interview them for every executive position, just as required in the NFL when there are coaching vacancies. Getting people in the workforce, that's crucial. Getting them used to working, understanding the responsibility of working, making money, functioning in the economy. Let's induce and incent corporations to bring many, many more low-income teenagers and young people into the workforce through training, and not only train them, but hire them. Generous tax credits to make that happen. Let's create a program, much more aggressive program, to give long-term residents of public housing the ability to buy their unit, frankly, even be given the unit, provided they can maintain it and have a history of maintaining the unit that they live in. It would be better for them to own those units than for the government to own them, and that would help alleviate the huge wealth gap that we have between African Americans and white people in the United States. As much as the federal government has done for the big banks, it used to be that these big Wall Street banks were too big to fail. Now they're too bigger to fail. The federal government has been very good to those banks. Let's get them to help get a lot more low-income African Americans into housing that they can afford and that's sustainable. That can be done. Just because we messed up subprime mortgages through sloppy administration and oversight back in the early 2000s doesn't mean that we can't come up with programs that will actually work. These banks have a ton of money. They have the capability to design financial products that can work in a wide range of situations. Let's make them do that so we can get a lot more African Americans in good housing and get them into the world of home ownership, which is such a crucial part of becoming part of the middle class of the United States. So I've outlined a broad plan for African American advancement with specific policies in a number of areas. As white Americans, we need to make African American advancement a priority, not just because we love our neighbor, but because it's crucial for our country to achieve its potential. We have not eradicated the virus of racism in our country, and indifference is no longer an option.